Today on Ancient DOS Games, we're covering a title I've been wanting to check out for quite a while now, as I'd played the demo version back as a kid and really enjoyed it. Zork Nemesis. The demo was incredibly atmospheric, with some amazing visuals, fitting music, and intriguing puzzle designs centered around alchemy, featuring a sizable chunk of the first part of the game, and I wanted more. So now that I've had a chance to play the full game, how does it compare? So yeah, Zork Nemesis is probably one of the biggest trolls of a game I've ever encountered, and this was not by accident. Even when you take a look at the box art for this thing, there is nothing suggesting that this is anything other than a fantasy stroll through a world of alchemy-based puzzles, and when you go by the track record set by prior Zork titles, since there were several, anyone picking this game up and getting through the first quarter of it is going to get completely blindsided by how incredibly disturbing this experience gets, while still somehow having the gall to keep a minor level of humor going the entire time.
Brace yourself, it's looking glass time.
But ironically, even though it completely missed my expectations by a mile and a half, it's still really well made. And even if things do take a severely dark turn, the game never stops being atmospheric. And the sound design is excellent, even though there's stock sound effects littered throughout this thing, and the acting is actually surprisingly decent, as they made it a selling point to indicate that the live action was directed by Joe Napolitano of X-Files directing fame. Even though, as far as I can tell, he only really directed 2 episodes of that series, but nonetheless, you can tell the actors here had proper direction.
If you didn't sleep with the Archbishop's daughter, I wouldn't even know that you were a man.
I don't want you to talk about her.
Ooh.
And as for the gameplay, it's decent. Like The Seventh Guest, this is a game which focuses much more so on individual puzzles rather than on inventory management. Now, don't get me wrong, there are a handful of inventory-based puzzles in the game, but they're not the focus by a long shot, and mostly just serve as stepping stones rather than as puzzles in and of themselves. With that said, some of the puzzles do get surprisingly challenging and a little convoluted, but the hints are all there. The game never asks you to make leaps of faith or to know things ahead of time. But still, there is a built-in hint system of sorts to help you out when things get too tricky, though I intentionally avoided using it because it made me feel, uncomfortable.
You must know how to advance through the 3. Touch me then.
You understand, we weren't innocents. We were alchemists, rebels, explorers, risking everything in the search for eternal life.
Zork Nemesis was developed by a game studio originally known simply as Zombie, and was published by Activision in 1996. It's a one-player adventure/puzzle game with some curious hardware requirements. Firstly, it only supports SVGA 640x480 graphics, but is also one of the extremely few DOS games not using hardware acceleration, which flat out requires support for high-color 15-bit or 16-bit display modes. This typically wasn't done because the instant you went from an 8-bit palette of 256 colors to a 5 bits per pixel mode supporting thousands of colors at a time, you doubled the workload for both the system and the graphics card, which could seriously impact performance. And this is probably a part of the reason why the game plays in as small a window as it does, which, yeah, I know it doesn't look like that, but trust me, we're getting to that. In terms of audio, it only supports 16-bit digitized audio devices, technically. Now, its setup program allows you to select a wide variety of MIDI devices, but there isn't a scrap of MIDI in this entire thing, so you don't have to worry about that. Instead, if you run the game with an 8-bit audio device, it needs to downsample everything on the fly, further cutting into the performance if you're trying to run this on minimum specs. Back when I was playing the demo version as a kid, we were indeed using an 8-bit audio card, Sound Blaster Pro 2.0 specifically, but also a Pentium 120 CPU, which is far more powerful than the minimum spec CPU of a 486DX266. So as long as you're not pushing the limits on the minimum specs, you can get away with using an 8-bit sound card. As for its current release date, it's still commercial but extremely easy to obtain. You can either get it as a digital download from GOG or Steam for the same price of $6, or if you want a physical copy, they are freaking everywhere. This game isn't even remotely rare, with loose copies of all 3 CDs in its original jewel case typically going for $5 to $10, and fully boxed copies, even sealed, going for $10 to $20. But one thing to keep in mind is that if you're trying to collect every release of this game, you might have a bit of a challenge on your hands, as this game came out in multiple anthology collections, some of which are cheap, some of which are not. But suffice to say, if all you want is just one copy of the game, digital or physical, you got plenty of options.
Oh, I know. Maybe you're the hero of the day.
Yeah, skipping the story section because the game actually gives you surprisingly little backstory. You basically play the role of someone who's been whisked away to the world of Zork by a group of 4 alchemists who are close to unlocking the secrets of something known as the Quintessence, or to give it its more familiar name, the Philosopher's Stone, a substance which could transmute mundane metals into gold, or even grant immortality to the one who bears it. The problem, though, was that some evil demon, known simply as Nemesis, stumbled upon the alchemists as they were close to their breakthrough and slaughtered them all. In fact, he even tells you this himself.
Have you come to seek the alchemists? Don't waste your time. I killed them all. You can do no good here.
Basically, your goal is to first rescue the alchemists from their immediate danger by providing them pure sources of their respective elements, then to use a special device to traverse to their respective locations throughout the solar system from which they worked, uncovering their memories and interacting with whatever was left behind, ultimately finding their labs in order to create the pure alchemical metals required to finish what they had started. Now, something I really need to point out is that this is not normally how the game looks. I've intentionally zoomed everything in because 100% of the time, the game plays like this. Yeah, I'm not even kidding. Even on a period-correct system, the actual visible space the game plays within is much smaller than the full screen. I also wanted to point out that I'm not going to be showing much of the later sections of the game because... Yeah, there's actually a few reasons, but beyond just keeping the video viewable for all audiences, I really don't want to spoil the experience or ruin the mystique to any great degree, given how easy it is to get this game. So do bear in mind that most of what you're going to be seeing me cover in this video is from roughly the first quarter of the game. As for the gameplay, it's incredibly straightforward. Most of the time you're able to turn the camera a full 360 degrees in any direction to view your surroundings, with your cursor changing to indicate when various things can be done by left clicking, with the right click being able to cycle through items in your inventory, since, again, you don't really carry enough items to require having a full featured inventory selection menu. Now, every type of mouse cursor also has a hollow dot, which sometimes shows a red light. This may seem pertinent, but it's actually a loading light. Since the game originally came on 3 CDs, the red light was simply to indicate things were loading and to avoid clicking, as it may get buffered into whatever the next area is. You do have to pay very careful attention to the mouse cursor though, because the way it changes as you move it across a scene can indicate a lot of useful information. Now, if the cursor changes to an arrow pointing both up and down together, this means the view can be shifted up or down by moving the cursor up or down until it changes to allow you to look in such a way. And if the cursor becomes a hand icon looking like it wants to pick something up, it means you can indeed pick up the item you're looking at. But if you see this hand show up and there's nothing to pick up, it sometimes means you can put something down in the same place instead. There's also occasionally moments where you have to click and drag things to operate them, such as spinning a wheel or pulling a lever. But depending on how your mouse is set up on a modern system through emulation, you may notice this process tends to resist your mouse movements and can be very finicky. Well, this is a result of how mouse drivers nowadays tend to incorporate a level of accelerative motion, so that the cursor moves more per physical distance traveled the faster you do it. And this process tends to interfere with mouse movement systems which attempt to affect the cursor while you're moving the mouse. It's just something to keep in mind when playing this through emulators or on retro hardware that's a bit newer than what this game needs. Now, as mentioned earlier, many of the puzzles revolve around alchemy, and we're not talking make-believe, mix local ingredients to make a healing potion alchemy. We're talking the real deal. Chemical science before science, the renaissance of the scientific process, where people were investigating the world around them, trying to figure out how everything worked, while at the same time trying to unlock theorized secrets to life, health, and wealth. Now, let's get one thing straight, alchemy is effectively proto-science. Many of the things alchemy alludes to revolve around philosophical beliefs, and the whole core of alchemy was to try and prove those beliefs, rather than figure out if those beliefs were even factual. Ultimately, alchemy was superseded by chemistry, and during the 18th century, the last serious practitioners of alchemy had all moved on to those stronger and more conclusive scientific approaches. But then where's the fun in that? Understanding core alchemical concepts will certainly help you solve the puzzles in this game, but even if you go into this game completely blind to the basic concepts of alchemy, the information you need to solve the puzzles can still be found. In fact, let me hold the footage on this scroll right here. If nothing else, this one page on this one scroll defines the most important alchemical information you need to know to make your way through this game, as it not only indicates the alchemical symbols for the 4 elements, earth, fire, air, and water, but it also shows you their planetary and metallurgical associations and their appropriate symbols, with air being related to the planet Jupiter and the metal tin, the element of Earth being related to the planet Mars and the metal iron, fire being related to the planet Saturn and the metal lead, and water being related to the planet Venus and the metal copper. Though, as is tradition with Zork games, all the planet names are different, since Zork takes place in a parallel universe to ours. As far as the puzzles themselves are concerned, I think a good way to sum it all up is that this game has you perform investigative puzzle solving. The vast majority of the puzzles in this game all follow a very specific pattern of learning various pieces of information and then using that information to deduce a conclusion which solves the puzzle. Now, sometimes it's almost blatantly obvious, especially early in the game, but later on this can get very tricky. Now, fortunately, you can usually screw up a puzzle and still be able to recover. I said usually. Yeah, it is possible to die in this game, but most of the deaths are easily avoidable, or at the very least, you should have seen it coming. Like this one right here. This keypad very obviously has some kind of high voltage running across it, so if you touch it with your bare hands, yeah, that's not gonna go well. Or how about this one?
Fattium particles detected. Fatality predicted in 45 seconds.
I mean, you could just put it right back in that protective shielding, or you can be a boob and just start walking around with the stuff in your hands till... Yeah, the point is, even though you should save frequently, don't be afraid of dying because it's fairly obvious when things are going to get dangerous. Yeah, I didn't think this was going to be a long episode, especially since it was important not to show too much from the later parts of the game due to how dark and graphic it can get. But all things considered, Zork Nemesis is an excellent game, if you want to get a little disturbed along the way. To be fair, the graphics do tend to have that early, pre-rendered 3D aesthetic to them, and not everyone likes that sort of art, but I love it. And while I'm not in love with the content following the first part of the game, the acting in the FMVs remains solid, the music completely fits the tone of everything going on, and for the most part, the puzzles are the perfect level of challenge, only occasionally straying into the very hard or somewhat easy side of things. Basically, if you like puzzle games, or adventures which have that slant of things going way off the rails in a very bad way, then you absolutely want to give this game a try. But if you can't stomach disturbing imagery, or are not a fan of puzzles, then there's nothing here for you. So, I need to point out that I have the GOG release of this game, which by default sets the cycles count to max. Do not do this, as this causes all kinds of skipping issues among other things. Instead, you want to set a moderately high fixed cycles count. I found 60,000 seemed to be the best number to go with. Also, something I find very peculiar is that this game doesn't work in DOSBox 0.74, even though it works perfectly fine in DOSBox 0.74-3, which is supposed to be nearly identical. So, whatever things were changed between 0.74 and 0.74-3 absolutely affected the way this thing works. So that's something to keep in mind if you're still using the older 0.74 release of DOSBox, is you're going to want to upgrade it if you want to play this game on a modern system. Also, based on how the GOG version works, it looks as though the game properly recognizes when all the contents of all 3 CDs are stored together in one place. So if you get a physical copy and want to run it on a modern system, I believe it should be possible to just copy all the files over and just run it easily without having to do any disk swapping or deal with CD load times. But I'm not 100% certain on that. If anyone's pulled this off, please let me know so I can add the details into the video description. And that's all for this episode of Ancient DOS Games. Managed to start the year with a 5 Saturday month, so next ADG video will be 2 weeks from now on Saturday, February 6th. And it's going to be an ADG mod video, as I've decided that ports of games to modern systems will make for valid ADG mod coverage if the port has enough significance and features to warrant a full video. And this one absolutely does, so make sure to stay tuned to see what old DOS game recently got such a significant port. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small set of you guys.